Hello. I just learned that I'm the butter in the cake, which I'm pretty happy about because I really like butter. How many of you in the audience have a mobile device in your pocket? Raise your hand. How many of you also have a tablet? You can raise the other hand. Yeah, so pretty much everyone has a mobile device with them. If you're a developer like me, you probably have multiple mobile devices with you, including tablets and smartphones. So it's pretty obvious that mobile is not going anywhere. It's going with us in our pockets. Mobile accessibility means that somebody with a disability would be able to use a mobile device to get around in the world. If you lost your eyesight or your hearing or an arm, it might impact how you use a mobile device. If you had a child that had a cognitive or learning disability, that you would want to ensure if they're using a mobile device to accelerate their learning that they can use it properly. So it's pretty important that we consider accessibility for mobile devices. Winning could be defined in many different ways. To me, I think of winning as laying on the floor, being smothered by puppies. But winning is a pretty abstract concept. What I want to focus on today is how can we combine mobile accessibility and winning? So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, how to win at mobile accessibility. I'm Marcy Sutton. I am an accessibility engineer at Adobe in Seattle. At Adobe, I work on making software more accessible to people with disabilities, and including everybody. So it's pretty exciting. I'm sort of new in that role, but I'm working on really big software, and I like having a big impact in the world with accessibility. I've also worked on the AngularJS framework in the past. I contribute to the ng-aria module, and I've written a plugin for Protractor, which is a testing framework. So I come at accessibility from a very technical place. And I don't have too much code in my slides today. I'll try to frame accessibility in a way that's that you can think about it technically, but also from a design perspective. My slides are available online at marcysutton.github.io/mobile-A11y. And if you ever see this short thing, A11y, that's a numeronym for accessibility. It's a lot shorter way to say accessibility. So today we're going to talk about barriers, things that get in the way of a user navigating the web or using a native app for accessibility. We'll talk about UI patterns and things you can actually control to make your mobile experiences more accessible. And then we'll look at what I'm calling the state of tooling. So using tools to actually make the process of designing and developing for accessibility easier, specifically for mobile devices. So it's pretty clear that mobile is a thing. It's an important thing. In the last few years, the ubiquity of mobile devices, they're everywhere. You all raised your hand, said you had a mobile device. The number of people in the world who only use a mobile device to connect the internet has surpassed the number of people who only use desktop to connect to the internet. Obviously, this is important. Pretty timely are articles like this one from the New York Times about refugees and migrants who count on their smartphone to help them communicate with people back home, figure out where they're going. So smartphones are a really important thing for us to be considering. I start wondering, what if a refugee has a disability? They're going to need this mobile device to get around in the world. So this makes it even more important that we consider everybody, not just the people like us. In accessibility, we don't really have analytics for privacy purposes. What we do have is this screen reader survey from WebAIM. WebAIM stands for Web Accessibility in Mind, and they're a really great organization. So the screen reader survey, the deal with this is that people with disabilities will self-report what browsers, what screen readers they use, and this gives us some data that we can actually look at accessibility and compare it with our own website's analytics to say, oh, okay, well, I don't really need to support IE7 anymore, or in the case of mobile platforms, iOS is the clear winner. And Android follows that. I tend to think of mobile accessibility as the big two, which differs from normal data for mobile devices. Android might be more popular than iOS outside of accessibility. But when I'm thinking about accessibility, I come back to these data points about iOS being 70% of the market share and Android being 21% of the market share to give me some frame of reference for where I can focus my attention. And we'll look a little bit later on in the talk about why we need to narrow our focus a little bit. On iOS, there are a lot of great accessibility features. You may or may not be aware of them. The screen reader on iOS, because yes, there are screen readers on mobile devices. VoiceOver is a fantastic screen reader. It's the same one that's on OS X on your desktop if you have an Apple. This allows people to have their mobile device actually say aloud what they are navigating on the screen. It makes a flat piece of glass actually accessible to somebody who's blind. Another great accessibility feature that many of us probably use is dictation. So if you're typing out a text message, instead of manually typing it, you could speak into the device. Or you could use Siri as a personal assistant. Also at the operating system level, you might increase the zoom. So you might zoom in on everything system-wide on your mobile device. You might invert the colors or set your screen to grayscale if that's easier for you to see. Some people might use a switch control, which is a device that allows you to have a single button to navigate through a web page, because maybe you can't use a keyboard, you can't use a mouse, you can't even really touch the screen, but you can use the switch control to navigate through the web. On Android, there's a similar set of features. TalkBack is the screen reader on Android. They also have their own version of switch access or switch control. They support Braille devices like iOS does. They support high contrast mode and magnification or zoom. So there's a similar set of features on both of these platforms that are great for people who need them. In the mobile world, and this sort of is the driving force for me behind this talk, are that there are multiple mobile contexts, and there are articles that people like to write claiming that one or the other is winning. Who's winning? Native's winning. Web is, we want to win because we don't want to concede defeat as web developers. But in the mobile world, if you were creating a mobile app, it could be one of these three things. It could be native. Say you're using Objective-C code to create an app that then gets pushed to the App Store, the iOS App Store or Google Play. There might be, in your workflow, you might have a client who wants you to create an app that you push to the App Store, but you're a web developer, and if you could use web technologies to create a native app, well, then you're creating what's called a hybrid app. So I want to point out these differences just to know, in the developer ecosystem, where you might lie. I'm way more on the web side, so we're going to focus on mobile web. And I actually find that when I ask people for mobile accessibility examples, they tend to go, native's winning. And they give me all these native examples. Like, okay, that's great. These are awesome. Really happy to see these. However, I really want the mobile web space and the hybrid accessibility space to get better. I refuse to concede defeat. So we're going to look at how we can actually make this space better. That said, I will admit, it is easier to get accessibility right on native platforms. If you're developing for iOS, it's like you're bowling and they have those bumpers in the lane and it kind of keeps you in check because there are tools that help you to figure out when you're doing it wrong. On the mobile web, we just haven't quite had those tools, and so it's a lot harder to get it right in the mobile web space. So when I read these articles about native versus mobile web, I feel like this penguin going through the tundra saying, "Come at me, bro." I feel like that about not accepting that mobile web is going to be terrible forever for accessibility. So come at me. I want to make this space better. So that's sort of where I'm coming from in this talk. So some barriers. What are these things that are actually preventing users from navigating your mobile website or your mobile app? In the real world, say you're blind and you have a guide dog and you're using Uber, and your Uber driver refuses to pick you up because you have a guide dog. That would be a barrier to access to their service, right? That's an in-person barrier. You might have similar problems, a barrier to their service if you're trying to use the Uber iOS app and it has accessibility problems. So these are just two quick examples of what a barrier might be. Some specific barriers that I see a lot out in the world. Lockdown zooming, so that you can't actually pinch and zoom on the device. And in that same vein, if you hijack the scrolling as a developer, you have somebody who says, I want the screen to lock into this page, and as the user scrolls, it will lock into the next page. We all know these techniques exist. I don't need to spend too much time on these. I just want to point out that this makes it really hard for a user to navigate a mobile website. One example of why this is hard and where we really need to open up zooming and allow a user to zoom in if they need to, is when the text is too small. When we are creating a responsive website, and we have a beautiful desktop version with beautiful typography, and then we scale it down to fit on a mobile device in a single column, sometimes the text gets so small that it's very hard to read. And the example I have is from the New York Times. They have some links and some text across all of their pages that when I look at them on a mobile device, they are so tiny. And because the zooming has been locked down, I can't zoom in to read it. Sure, I could increase the zoom from the operating system level, but to make a user go all the way back to their settings, change the zoom level, and then come back to the mobile browser just because that one piece of text is too small is putting the burden on the user. So what would be better is if the text was bigger, or if you had a button to allow them to increase the text size on the actual mobile device. That would make it easier for somebody who has low vision or poor vision to be able to see what's on the screen. Visual clutter. I have an example of a website that has not been optimized for mobile, but even if it had, it's so cluttered and so overwhelming that you don't even know where to go. There's no visual hierarchy. There is absolutely no breathing room on this website. In my slides, I have a resource from the Nielsen-Norman group about minimizing cognitive load. And that means that the amount of stuff that you cram into a mobile web page could make it hard for somebody to focus, make it hard for them to figure out what to even click on. So if we try to give things more breathing room, avoid this idea of visual clutter, it can actually minimize somebody's cognitive load and make it easier for them to navigate your website and then do other things because you've freed up brain power. Ambiguous visual icons. So when it comes to icons, they might make perfect sense to you as the designer in your demographic or your age. But to some other people, they might not know what those icons mean. For example, does a floppy disk really mean save if you don't know what a floppy disk is? We use that one a lot. If you use a house icon to mean home, are you relying on the fact that everyone else has done that before? Is it convention enough for people to know that a house means home? Or a hamburger icon. Outside of the tech world, some people don't know what a hamburger icon is. And when's the last time you used a magnifying glass to actually search for something? Some random ones, like a bar chart icon, the meaning for that particular icon could change from app to app. So somebody might not know what that icon means in your particular ecosystem. So what would help? Say you're going to use these icons. Okay, fair enough. The house icon means home. If you add a text label to it, that removes any confusion about what that icon is for. So I would recommend that if you're using visual icons like this, consider adding a text label underneath. Turns out, also, if the icon fails to load, you have some text under it, and then the user can continue to use it. Another barrier that I see is the idea of a conflicting gesture. So if you have an interface, and there's a swipe interface, and my example is from the Ionic framework, they have a great demo that the content shows in these cards. And so the card could have any kind of content in it. When you swipe, you can go to the next card. Works great unless you are using a screen reader. And then that gesture has already been accounted for, and so you can't actually navigate this interface when you have a screen reader running. So what I would recommend for this is add some other kind of what I call an affordance, like a button maybe, some other way for a screen reader user to be able to navigate the interface. And so if you have a very touch, swipe heavy interface, you should consider, can a screen reader user still use this? Fragmentation. When I think about mobile development and design, I think of fragmentation. And I have a graphic from Android, actually, and it's all of the different screen sizes. And if you've ever been given a design that's pixel perfect, 320 pixels wide, and you go, how is this going to fit in a bigger phone? That's part of the challenge, is that we have to accept that things need to be more fluid and actually adapt to different device sizes. Brad Frost wrote this great piece called Device Fatigue that talked about how we are sometimes overwhelmed with how big this landscape is, how many devices there are. And even if you're just trying to test something, between iOS and Android, sometimes it can be really tiring. On top of that, in accessibility, because that was just talking about screen sizes and actual platforms, in accessibility, we tend to pile on top of that the number of things that we have to support. What makes this challenging is that the support for HTML5, which has accessibility baked into it, support for that and ARIA, which stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And I'm not going to talk too much about ARIA, but if you're curious, I have a link in my slides about using ARIA. The support for this on mobile devices is a little less mature than desktop. So that means that you might go to use HTML5 or ARIA and expect it to work. But on the mobile device, the support in that browser might not quite be there yet. And so this is just something that we have to deal with. We have to look for support and test it, and then report back to these mobile browsers that, hey, the support isn't quite there yet. So it's just something to be aware of if you're developing for the mobile web. So there's that, all the screen sizes, and then on top of that, a user who relies on technology for accessibility purpose might have any number of assistive technology devices and those user settings that I mentioned. So maybe they're using assistive technology, maybe they're zooming in so that text doesn't fit exactly the way that you wanted or exactly the way that you designed it. We sort of just have to let go and just accept that people are going to navigate our websites, our mobile websites, the way that they need to. So we should try and make it flexible. But back to winning, my video I want to get to play. I have this kid dancing, being awesome, and I just think he's winning. He's smiling, he's dancing, having fun. So that part of mobile web that's so painful, like how can we combine that with winning? How can we make it feel more like this kid doing his dance? I feel like I have to dance for anyone who can't see. It's kind of on the screen, or at least describe how much fun this kid is having. I want to capture that feeling in mobile web, mobile web accessibility. So how do we do that? How do we capture the joy on that kid's face as he's dancing in mobile web accessibility? Well, the part that we can control, if we can't control the browsers or the support or how many devices our users are using on top of our mobile experiences, what can we control? We control the interfaces that we actually design and put out there in terms of like the way that they look. So we're going to talk about some mobile UI patterns and how you can actually win. I have to point out that you are competing against the browser's reader button. So a blind friend of mine, Marco Zija, he says that his most used button in the mobile web is the reader view available. So he will just bypass your design and your site entirely and go to this reader view in iOS. And the reason for that is because it strips out all of the unnecessary links, all of the unnecessary content, and then it floats up just the text. So he can get to reading an article much faster as a blind user. So you should know that when you're slaving over the pixel perfect fidelity of your design and getting it, responsive designs perfect, that some accessibility users might skip it entirely, which as a perfectionist developer drives me bananas. So you should know that simplifying your web pages and adding skip links and all of these accessibility features will keep somebody actually on your site and actually reading the content. So a great resource to actually try and make your mobile spaces better are the BBC's mobile accessibility guidelines. And it's kind of unique. I haven't seen many resources like this at this level, but the BBC has put together some fantastic guidelines, and they break it up by audience. So they have content for developers and designers and content writers, because there are different people who need to consider accessibility. And this will give you a wonderful checklist that you can go through and actually identify what can I do in my app. So if there's one thing from my talk that you take away, these guidelines are probably a good one, because you can take action when you go home. So, some more about UI patterns. Something I see a lot, and I'm going to pick on CNN, but this is not unique to them, are that on mobile websites that have buttons, like the hamburger button that I mentioned earlier, which is often a menu button, they will just use a div element in HTML. And a div element is a generic HTML element that doesn't have any semantics. It's not reachable from a keyboard or a screen reader. And so if you're using a generic div like this, someone relying on a screen reader won't be able to use that button at all. They won't even know it's there. So it's important that we actually use the real button element. And similarly, semantic elements in HTML in general, this is why it's important, is so that a screen reader user, you can do the minimum amount of work to support them. So to fix this, CNN's menu button, all I did was convert the tag from a div to a button. That makes it reachable from a screen reader, or in the desktop world from a keyboard. And then, one step further, because it has this icon in it and it doesn't have any text, it needs a label. So a big thing in mobile accessibility is that we need to actually label things. And this is true for iOS, native and hybrid apps as well. So there are multiple ways you can add labels. And I have a really great article in my slides from Hayden Pickering on using the ARIA label attribute in HTML. And the idea with ARIA label is that you can add this metadata, basically, onto an HTML element that only has an icon in it. I did mention earlier that adding a text label under the icon would make it easier for people with cognitive disabilities. However, in this case, CNN could easily fix their button for a screen reader just by adding ARIA-label and then the name of the button. So in this case, it's a menu. So changing the tag name and adding an ARIA label are two really easy wins that you could do to actually make your buttons more accessible. Touch targets. So the actual space that you allow, the affordances for users to actually tap on things on your mobile sites. So I'm picking on Creative Block, which ironically they have an article called The Top 10 Mobile Design Mistakes and How to Avoid Them. And then because in the EU you have these cookie warnings, they have a couple of cookie warnings popping up on their mobile site. But I've isolated one of them using VoiceOver on iOS so that you can see the outline of the actual button. So there's a white box that has an X in it. And the white area looks like it should be the entire button. However, the width of the action target is just the letter X. And so if we actually made the space, all they would have to do is add a little bit of padding to make the X the full width of the white box. That would make it a bigger touch target so that your fat human finger, like mine, would be able to tap on this button a lot easier. Taking it like way further, someone who does this the best, I'd argue, is Simply Accessible. They are an accessibility consulting company in Canada and the US. And on their mobile site, which is a shining, gorgeous, responsive, accessible example, their menu button goes all the way across the screen. And so I've isolated it with VoiceOver. It's not normally black. It's just a button that seamlessly sits in the header of their website. But this allows us a screen reader user, and everybody actually, it gives you a way bigger target for your finger. So by adding more generous padding and letting buttons take up more of the screen, you just make it easier to hit these targets. So let's do that more. Crafting your source order. So I have an example from the Huge website. And actually, this is an example of scroll jacking, which I talked about a little bit briefly earlier. And they have an article about how they justify or try to justify using this scroll jacking. So their interface has multiple screens. And when you use your finger to slide between them, they sort of lock into place. And so that's the scroll jacking experience. Each screen that is not visible anymore, you can't see it, so they're off screen. The problem is that they haven't actually hidden the content that's off screen. So for a screen reader user, I can still navigate through all of the off-screen content. So let's look at what that actually sounds like. I have an example of this, because again, it's not unique to Huge, this happens all the time. I've been working on a framework called Angular, and they have a UI component library called Angular Material. And one of their components that I've worked on is a dialog. It's sort of like an operating system's native dialog, except it's made completely custom with web technologies. So I'm going to play a clip from my iOS device. I've recorded VoiceOver, the screen reader, and the action that I'm taking is a single finger swipe. And I didn't know that this existed before I worked on this dialog. And it highlighted to me how important it is to actually hide content. So with a single finger swipe, you'll hear me go through the tab order on a mobile web page, and we'll see what happens before I actually added the fixes.
Basic usage. Heading, view source, button, edit on code pen. Open a dialog over the app's content. Basic usage. View source. Alert, button. Alert.
I missed.
Alert, button, alert. This is an alert title. Heading, you can specify some description text in here. Got IT, button. You can specify some description text. This is an alert title. Main, custom, confirm, alert, button. Open a dialog over the app, edit on.
So you see, let me break down what happened here. I swiped through the page and I slipped a couple times, so that's why it kind of jumped around. But when I get to a button that launches a dialog, focus is sent into the dialog, which is correct, that's what we want to have happen. That actually directs a screen reader user to the new content, and it makes them aware that a dialog has even opened. So that part's working okay. What's not working is that when I swipe through the tab order once it's open, I get to the end of the tab order, and then I went backwards, and I was able to reach all of the buttons behind a dialog, which for a screen reader user would be totally confusing. The idea with a dialog is that you actually disable everything behind it. That's what an operating system native dialog would do. So I discovered this whole world of like mobile tab order and having to actually hide content, and it happens a lot. Obviously, it happened to me with this dialog, and I had to fix it. It happened to Huge on their website. All of their off-screen content had the same problem. So how do you fix that? There's a couple different ways. One way to actually hide content for accessibility is to hide it with CSS using the display none property. This is a really handy tool, so you should know whether something is hidden or not from a screen reader. Display none in CSS will actually affect a screen reader. There's one problem with this, actually two problems. It's not animatable. So if you're animating something and you hit display none, poof, it'll be gone. It also, for the dialog in Angular Material, the content behind the dialog is still visible. I don't want to fully hide it, but I need to hide it from a screen reader, so I need to use another technique. I used a combination of HTML attributes, including tab index. So something like a button, it natively has tab index. You don't have to add this attribute when it's tabbable by default, like a link or a button or a form control. Those are natively reachable from a keyboard or a screen reader. So if I have a button and I want to disable it, I can add tab index and then put the value of -1. And that is this magic attribute that will pull an element out of the tab order and keep a screen reader or a keyboard from actually accessing it. In combination with that, I can use the aria-hidden property, or the attribute. And if I put aria-hidden of true, that will just completely hide it from a screen reader. So these two attributes used together will hide that content behind the dialog. So let's see what that looks like, again, in the screen reader after I've fixed it. So I'm going to use that single finger swipe through the tab order again, and we'll see what that looks like.
Source, button, edit on code pen, open a dialog over the app's content. Press alert, button. Alert, this is an alert title. Heading you can specify some description text in here. Got IT, button.
So I'm at the end, I'm going to go backwards.
You can specify some this is an alert title.
All right. So that worked. I was able to properly hide the content. So using a little bit of HTML attribute magic, I'm able to control or craft the source order and the tab order of the page so that someone using a screen reader will have a good experience. They won't get stuck behind a dialog and go, what the heck is happening? So those are some UI patterns that we can actually control as developers and designers to make our websites more accessible. So the last thing that I want to touch on is what I'm calling the state of tooling. And as a developer who's pretty passionate about tooling, automated testing, browser tools and extensions, I've been tracking the state of mobile web accessibility testing because it was pretty dismal when I started. And even in the last few weeks, I found that it's already getting better. And so by talking to browser vendors at Apple, Mozilla, and Google, I'm actually able to talk directly with people who work on dev tools and say, hey, it would be great if we had this thing. So I'm talking with them and trying to make the space better, because I think that this is sort of the key to hooking developers into the accessibility world who might not have already thought about it. We can sort of float up the low-hanging fruit, the easy things that we can fix in our mobile websites by giving them tools to make this possible. So something that's worth pointing out, because we have tools for desktop browsers, and there are browser mobile emulators, like in Chrome and in Firefox. You can tap on this little button that will simulate a mobile device. The issue is that you're still testing against the desktop browser. There are actual platform browser differences between, say, iOS Safari and OS X Safari. So we have to actually test on the mobile device itself. So this is what I'm trying to get at, because we have pretty good desktop tools. We don't have really great mobile browser tools. So I have an example of an ARIA screen reader compatibility checklist, and the ARIA described by attribute is not supported on iOS, or it is supported on iOS on a link, but on OS X it has slightly different support. And so this is that spotty support thing that I mentioned earlier, that sometimes it's hard to keep track. So if we had tools that could point it out for us, that would really help us to know whether something works or not. Because iOS has that 70% market share that I pointed out, the screen reader survey from WebAIM, that's what people are reporting, that most accessibility users use iOS. So it's pretty important that we actually test iOS. So since the last time I did a version of this talk, I have learned a lot more about the accessibility node inspector for iOS Safari. So if you tether your mobile device, like an iPhone, you plug it in with your USB cable, hook it into your laptop. In Safari now, you can actually debug the accessibility situation in Safari. And so this is a really great tool to actually check what's going on in the mobile device. What I really want to see is an audit that can run a set of rules against your mobile website and say, hey, you're forgetting a label. Or you have an issue with multiple IDs or something, so you're actually running a set of tests against the mobile device. That would be awesome. Turns out, this is something that Apple has been wishing for a while. And so in the WebKit bug tracker, there is a ticket in there for a web accessibility audit in the web inspector. So somebody is going to do this. I think Apple can do it better than anyone else, but this is out there for anybody to go pick up. And you can check out WebKit. It's an open source browser. So I'm keeping track of this to see how far we get. It would be really awesome to have it in Safari. One tool that we do have, this is sort of the promising nugget that I'm keeping my eye on, is this tool called Axe, and it's by a company named DQ. They made this open source engine, they're calling it, called Axe, where you can run this kind of an audit that I've been looking for. You can run it against your desktop site and have it report back to you what's wrong with it. So I have an audit I ran on my site. It's complaining about tab index, because I have a skip to content link that I have come first. And so it's complaining about the tab index number I've chosen, saying that's a problem. So it's sort of a false positive in this case. It's also complaining about YouTube's video, something I also can't control because I can't control YouTube's markup. So sometimes we have to take this with a grain of salt. But if I had issues with missing labels or missing alt text, this tool would tell me, and it would be a really easy way to go and fix things. So in the Firefox developer tools on desktop, we have this fantastic extension that we can use to check accessibility. But we can't run it against the mobile device quite yet. So that's what I'm working with Mozilla to try and get into the browser. So if you're testing a mobile device in Firefox, they have this tool called Web IDE. which you tether a mobile device with USB. You can use Firefox and Android, which is another popular browser for accessibility. You can actually plug your iOS device in there too. But there are no extensions in WebIDE right now. So my friends at Mozilla are plugging away, trying to figure out what's going on with this thing. So what we really want is that Axe tool to run in WebIDE, so we can actually evaluate against a mobile device. So here's an image of WebIDE of where we would want that audit tool to go, and that way you're actually running the audit against the device. So Chrome for Android. Chrome's accessibility developer tools is one of my favorite extensions out there, and there's some really great work being done by Alice Boxhall, working accessibility features into the core Chrome browser so that it's not an extension and it's in the browser, because you have similar access, different access whether you're an extension versus if you're part of a core browser. So Android on Chrome, it's not as popular of a browser for accessibility. However, the tooling for Chrome's developer tools is really great. So you can tether an Android device and open up Chrome and then debug it in the developer tools. So to do this, you go to chrome://inspect, and it will give you a list of your devices that are plugged in. I have a Nexus Android device, and I can go and inspect it. I discovered the other day you can actually run an audit against Chrome for Android. So this is what we want. We want to tether a device, run a set of tests against it, and have it report back to us what's broken. Like, this is awesome. There's one problem. Nobody uses mobile Chrome for accessibility yet. So this is a great example of like what we want. And actually Alice told me she was not even sure how this was working. It was really cool getting to talk to her about like, how is this even working? Turns out there's a developer tools API that's making this possible because of that sandbox script access I mentioned. So this is what we want. We want an audit tool that actually runs against a tethered device. So we're kind of working backward from there, like what we want, where are we at now, and then a year from now, I'm hoping that we will have gotten this to be in a better place. So let's recap. We need mobile testing tools. We need things that actually run against the device. That would be fantastic, and we're getting there. By pushing and talking to browser vendors, we're actually making this better and not making it so that we have to concede defeat to native accessibility. We want to use semantics, use those button elements and use native HTML5 elements so that you get easy wins for accessibility. Because there's been a lot of work done to bake accessibility into HTML for you, so you don't have to get as in the weeds with accessibility as I might do as an accessibility engineer. So take my advice, use semantics. Optimize for humans, optimize for fat fingers, optimize for people who don't know what icons mean. Just think about users who maybe aren't like you and design for them. And a great way to do that would be to do some user testing. Get your app in front of people and see, does this make sense? Is this intuitive? Can I make this more clear just by adding a text label? And so it's important to include users in your testing process. Craft your source and tab order. I think the source order thing we've gotten more accustomed to with responsive design, taking a 3-column wide design and then taking it down to 1 column. You put the most important content first, because otherwise it would, your sidebar comes after your main content. So I think we've gotten used to crafting the source order. What we need to put on top of that is actually maintaining the tab order. And we saw that in the Angular material dialog, how you could access content that's supposed to be hidden. So we want to craft both the source and the tab order for users. And keep pushing on this stuff. This is what I'm pushing on browser vendors, pushing back in design to try and make things more accessible. It takes participation from everybody. This is like all of our responsibility to make the web a more accessible place. So if we keep pushing on it, we can keep making it better. I'm pretty optimistic that we can win if we keep at it. So thanks for listening.